That's perfect. Hello and welcome to all of you. Welcome to this webinar on socio-economic models in sport. We are delighted to be organising this in partnership with the French Institute for Civil Society in French and English. Next slide, please. This webinar is part of a broad context on three levels. The first is the global level in terms of SDGs and sustainable development, because it demonstrates that in the light of the current complex transformations, all organizations, whether these are businesses, associations, civil society, organizations, etc., are wondering about how to remain functional and how to change. And then the second element is the national framework. Since 2020, the GEPFA and the RAMEAU have been co-steering the reconnaissance program on socio-economic models in the public interest to share a shared culture of the diversity of models, and then to enable each person to take a stance, to know where they are and to get to grips with it, depending on their profile. And then the third element is a more general issue, that is to collectively understand and learn about the complexity of socio-economic trajectories. Since 2023, the platform on socio-economic trajectories, which has been developed with the ministry in charge of this and has been worked on by the Foundation since 2023, has been engaged in collective work to show the value of emerging practices and develop useful competencies and skills in order to sustain these collective models for the public interest over time. So when we talk about building on these programs, these webinars take place every third Thursday of the month. And in terms of capitalization, there are two strands. There's firstly the socio-economic platform, which enables you to access replays and summaries of all webinars since October 2020. And there's also an Impact Alliance aspect where you can have access to statements that might interest you personally. There are public and private decision makers who have been speaking on these platforms since 2023. So next slide, please. Currently, what brings us here this year is a cycle called Impact and Trajectories in Socioeconomics. And each month we try to highlight the dimension which concerns actors and also localized areas and ecosystems. And today, along with the French Institute for Civil Society organizations, we are delighted to be continuing on the aspect concerning public interest actors in implementing these modes in the world of sport. And so each month you have a session either on general interest actors or impacts on socioeconomic trajectories. Next slide, please. So on today's menu, we're going to have three different spaces. Firstly, on the issue of the day, that is socio-economic models in sport, with inspiring statements about what has been going on in the CEMASC project, and then empirical research on the theme of transitions and learning to link theories and practices. And then we will share the updates from the month of June, in which the ecological transition is at the heart. Next slide, please. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Florian Covelli, Director General of the French Institute for Civil Society Organizations, to present this very exciting meeting. Thank you very much, Jan. Thank you to Le RAMEAU for inviting the Institute to moderate this session on socio-economic models in the sporting sector. So first, I'd like to briefly present the Institute So the French Institute for CSOs, we try to boost knowledge in the civil society sector, building links between the needs for knowledge expressed by associations and CSOs and by their partners on the other hand, and also bringing in the world of research. So it's a role which involves research and development and leads us to specific results for the CSO sector, for local authorities and for foundations. And we will have a point on this specifically in a moment. I'm very pleased to be moderating this roundtable because I think that there's a real link between the researchers and the actors I'm going to present in a minute. And that ties into the work that we've done on socio-economic models in CSO structures, and it also ties into the sporting world and its actors. It's very good to connect between the different actors in this way, between sports clubs, CSOs, and to do this both in Europe and Latin America, as you'll see. So to get onto the main subject of our webinar, I'm delighted to welcome three experts. Jan Keron, you are an associate professor at the UFR3S Lille University. You're responsible for you're director of the Master Erasmus Mundus Goals, Governance, Administration, Leisure and Sports. You're also a researcher at the Pluridisciplinary Research Unit in Sport, Health and Society in the Sherpas team. You're also involved in the Club Monitoring Committee at the French Football Federation and a member of the National Sports Observatory. Your experience has seen you involved in links in conjunction with actors with other countries, and you have also been, you've become coordinator of the Erasmus Plus Sport project, CEMASC, Socio-Economic Models of Amateur Sports Clubs, which you are going to present to us in a few minutes. Guillaume Delcourt, for 30 years, you have been an expert in supporting the socio-economic models of sports associations, and for 25 years, you've been involved in the Olympic sector at local level in supporting associations, leagues and committees linked with public policy at national level at the French National Olympic and Sports Committee, the CNOSF, with specific missions to do with integrating people via sport, supporting federations in their strategies concerning sporting equipment and the needs for places to train. And then Andre Calopez, you are a PhD student at the University of Lisbon and also a consultant to football club associations. So perhaps just for those of you who are participating in the webinar, we will have a time for questions and answers at the end after the main body of the webinar, which will last just under an hour. So please do not hesitate to click on the question and response icon that you can see at the bottom of your screen. It's a question mark to ask your questions as we go along, and then we'll answer them at the end. So Jan, we're going to start with you. So we could perhaps start by asking what the CEMASC project is. Where did it come from? Why an international project and why South America? Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to present this project, which is co-funded by the European Union, which you can see here. It's based on the socio-economic models of sports clubs. So the project came from, firstly, research that was carried out into the socio-economic model of sports clubs in the Hauts-de-France region in the north of France, and which we were involved in as researchers at the EUREPS laboratory. And which was carried out in conjunction with the regional committee in the Hauts-de-France region. So what we wanted to do was understand the different pillars of the socio-economic models of amateur sports clubs. We found that there were these three pillars, and we added in a few other dimensions too, to enable understanding of what the socio-economic models of sports clubs could be in this region of Hauts-de-France. And there was a real will to very quickly extend this to other regions of France. As Florian Covelli said, I have been lucky enough to coordinate a master's program, an Erasmus Mundus master's program with 4 of the European universities, including the University of Lisbon. which Andre Calapes is doing his PhD at. And this was to see if there was a reflection that was ongoing in sports clubs in France, and to see if we could extend this to Europe. There were some international trips to Latin America, to South America rather. So that was funded by the Hauts-de-France region, and I was able to discuss with other partners in other sports movements and in universities too, to try to understand what their socio-economic models could be in Latin America. And there was the following dimension, that is that amateur sports clubs in Latin America and in France are facing economic crises. We saw that during the COVID crisis. And so the aim was to say, well, we could perhaps learn from our respective models. And the CEMASC project was linked also to the French Olympic and Sport Committee in order to obtain an Erasmus Plus sport funding, which we got in 2022, and which has enabled us to achieve a number of results. Thank you very much, Jan. And now, let's go on to Andre. Can you please tell us what are your initial results? This survey investigation is still ongoing, but we're lucky enough to have you here to share the first results obtained from this survey carried out in the first phase of the CEMASC project.
Hello everyone, good morning. So first, thank you to Florian for the kind introduction, and to Jan as well for introducing the CEMASC project. So we'll start off with some general information about the data collected. We'll go through the dimensions that we decided that would be okay for the CEMASC project, taking into consideration the literature review that we conducted. So regarding this first general information, we'll look first at the regions, and we can see that European clubs represent 79% of our total sample, making them the majority in our database. And football clearly stands out as the most represented primary sport, accounting for 21%, followed followed by basketball and tennis with 8.8 and 6.1%. And looking at our first regional comparison, we see that most clubs, both in Europe and South America, follow a unisport model with 74% in Europe and 58% in South America. You can go to the next slide, and we'll go for more region comparisons. We'll be focusing on region comparisons now. So we begin to notice some regional differences here, starting with the competitive level of the club's top teams. So in Europe, most teams compete at the national level with a balanced distribution across regional, state, and other levels. And in South America, while the national level is also prominent, there is a significant proportion of teams competing at a metropolitan level, which does not happen in Europe. Regarding club size measured here by the number of members, in Europe, the majority of clubs have between 101 and 400 members. This accounts for 57%. And in South America, the largest group consists between 0 to 100 members. And this distinction is particularly relevant when we consider revenue distribution, which we'll explore later. So this is the first strong indicator of maybe some financial disparity between regions. Finally, just finishing up, in terms of federation affiliation, most clubs in Europe and South America are members of their respective national federations. You can go to the next slide. So here we look at the organizational challenges, the organizational problems, and we observe both common trends and also some regional differences between regions. So in both Europe and South America, clubs frequently report problems in recruiting and retaining volunteers, as well as a challenge of participating in competitive sports. These appear to be consistent among the top 5 most common issues in the clubs. However, there are the remaining challenges differ between regions. So in Europe, clubs struggle particularly with recruiting qualified coaches and with attracting spectators. And in South America, the main concerns are mostly related to the structure, in the sense that the significant issues are related to the financial situation and to the adequacy of their sports facilities. We can go to the next slide. And to close this section on general information, we look at which associative project do clubs give more priority to. So in Europe, the leading priority is clearly physical motivation with 52%, followed by conviviality with 38%. And a similar trend is clearly observed in South America, where physical motivation is even more dominant and followed also by conviviality. This highlights the universal importance of health and social connection. So here in the infrastructure slide, we have that in Europe, the vast majority of clubs do not own a sports facility. In South America, the situation is more balanced. So 53% of the clubs are not owners, while 46% own their own infrastructures. And when it comes to the use of private facilities, European clubs rarely use them, whereas in South America, there is again like a more balanced distribution. And finally, regarding the use of public facilities, a very high proportion of European clubs rely on public infrastructures. And in South America, the usage is also high, but it shows a more spread out usage between public, private, and own options. We can move now onto the human resources dimension. So here, starting with the volunteers, in Europe, most clubs report having between 0 and 30 volunteers, mainly concentrated in the 0 to 10 and 11 to 30 ranges. In South America, clubs report a greater difficulty in volunteer recruitment, with 79% having 0 to 10 volunteers. Looking at the number of employees, in Europe, most clubs have either no employees or 1 to 10 employees, with very few reporting higher staff numbers. And South American clubs show a more balanced distribution. So 31% have no employees, 49% have 1 to 10, and then 12% have 11 to 20. Finally, regarding paid executives, the numbers are somewhat similar between the two regions, but South America has a higher proportion of clubs with 1 to 10 paid executives compared to Europe. So it's 26% compared to 16.4 in Europe. Now we take a look at the finance dimension. We look at the annual budgets first. In Europe, there's a more modest and stable financial structure, probably linked to the volunteer-based model that we saw before. So over 50% of European clubs operate with a budget between 0 and 50,000. In South America, there's a wider spread, with a significant portion of clubs reporting budgets between 10 and 50,000 euros. Interestingly, in recent years, on the second graph, we can see that European clubs have experienced budget increases, while South American clubs are more likely to report a budget decrease. We can move on now to the next slide. So here, the distribution of revenues. We see some important patterns. So in both regions, membership fees are a key source of incomes for the clubs in those regions, highlighting the essential role of engaged club members, as we saw before on one of the first slides. In Europe, public subsidies are especially critical for the financial sustainability of clubs. And in South America, while public support seems to be relevant, there is also sponsorships and social events that play a pivotal role in club funding. As I said before, the more members a club has, the greater its potential revenue, not only through the fees, but also through volunteer support, which reduces operational costs and increases the financial sustainability of amateur organizations. You can move on to slide 11. So here, looking at alliances and cooperation, the alliance dimension, in terms of partnerships with public authorities, European clubs show a higher level of cooperation, 65.4% compared to the 56% in South America. Regarding the collaboration with companies, the majority of clubs in both regions report that there are not corporate partnerships. The percentage of the clubs that do is still higher in Europe. And finally, South America tends to lead in partnerships with other amateur clubs, with 52% of clubs reporting such collaborations compared to the 36% in Europe. So the numbers reflect here somewhat of different approaches regarding their community network and the institutional support across both regions. We can move on now here to our last slide. So to summarize everything, we see that European clubs are clearly more represented in our database. We see that football is the most common sport as the dominant one across all clubs. The Unisport model dominates in Europe, and in South America, while it's also greater, it shows a more balanced approach. There are common challenges for both regions. However, South American clubs face more severe financial and facility-related issues, while European clubs struggle more with coach recruitment and audience engagement. Most of the clubs are members of national federations, and European clubs normally do not own their own facilities, relying very heavily on public infrastructure. And in contrast, South American clubs show a more balanced model of facility ownership. Let's put it like that. In both regions, budgets are similar. Everything was of course checked in euros. Membership fees and public subsidies are key revenue sources. As we said, in South America, sponsorship and social events are also very pivotal for clubs. More South American clubs report a recent decrease in budget compared to European ones. And in terms of alliances and partnerships, we see that public authorities and companies are somewhat more likely in Europe, and with other clubs, we tend to see that type of relationship happens more in South America. So these insights underline our need to keep collecting data to create an even clear and more robust picture here of the amateur sport ecosystem that will help us further shape and guide practical recommendations for clubs and other stakeholders. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Andre, for that very clear presentation. We're now going to turn to Guillaume Delcourt, but first, we'd like to remind you in the chat, please feel free to ask your questions as we go along by using the question response tab so that we can then answer the questions after our speakers. So Guillaume, now we'll move on to you. Can you tell us why the issue of socio-economic models are receiving so much attention in the world of sport currently? We've seen that there are questions about cooperation and relations with public partners. And so how have you seen, particularly in France, expectations and relations to sports policy change, particularly locally with regard to sports clubs? And can you tell us a bit about the organizations and their strategies, also concerning the federations? Yes, as it was said in the introduction, there's this issue of the socio-economic models, and that's not a new question. It's been around for 30 years in the sports sector, particularly with regard to the public authorities, because the local authorities are often the ones supporting local clubs. And at this point, I must say that in France, there is an organization which is very structural at local level, where clubs are working on the ground and carrying out their sporting practices. And they're then federated in different networks. There's a departmental and regional network, and then there's a network leadership at national level represented by the Federation of the Sports Discipline concerned. And so for 30 years, we've seen public policy to help the civil society sector and clubs. And this has often been diverted into support for employment. Rather, that's where it's been oriented. And we can see this at several levels. We can see that there's a move away from public funding in sport, particularly with the current events in the world that I'm sure you've read in the paper. And then the job situation became particularly clear in the 90s and 2000s with a program which was called Jobs for Young People, or New Jobs. That was a state program where there was help directed into the amateur sports club sector in order to be able to employ people to help these clubs. And this took the form over time of taking on qualified people, which of course represents a cost, and involving clubs in an obligation to seek further resources to continue the presence of these professionals. So there have been these aid programs by successive governments in order to extend these jobs and help them to continue supporting sporting clubs in opening up their economic modus operandi. And as part of this, there has been more and more frequent use of consultants and private companies, which have mobilized a number of levers in order to boost this economic wealth. We could mention the classic formula of telling sports clubs, well, you need to increase your membership fees, which of course raises questions in the civil society sector, in the public interest sector. That's almost always a problem. And so then there's thought given to, or rather, you can't just increase fees when you're working in the social sector. And then there was the idea to expand the target audience, developing offerings for younger people, for children, for 5 to 6 year olds, for elderly people. So diversifying the number of services on offer and diversifying the target audience. And then including technical innovation, social innovation, to open up to new sports, whether these are more or less integrated in the federal context. And that led us on to the question of service provision, which is a real question. When you're a non-profit association, and there are tax issues, of course, that come into this. So these are issues that have complexified the management of sports clubs. And recently, with the digital transition, we've seen more and more digital tools appearing, which enable us to open up to new ways of generating resources or bringing in new members. So we've seen a number of digital solutions for memberships, for collecting membership dues, or using digital wallets with cashback systems, which you can find these also on offer in banks. And it helps you to get back a little bit of money and then donate this to your club of choice. And that's available on certain applications such as Ma Petite Sponsor. That's an application that was put in place by the French National Olympic and Sport Committee. And then more and more that we're seeing one person doing different jobs across different clubs. And this leads to groups of employees emerging. That's to try to get around administrative limitations, which can be quite a burden on small clubs. Also in the federal movement, 66% of clubs have more than 100 licenses, and almost 90% of federal associations have more than 500 members. So we're talking about big clubs here. For example, those that you might find in Germany, where there are, rather in Germany, the numbers are much bigger. You might have 1,000 or 2,000 members. So that's another level. And so these initial reflections led us on to ideas of an economic nature, primarily. There's the social issue, which we can see currently in different types of support. One which has been experimented with recently over the past few years in the Hauts-de-France region, based on the social centres organisation. It's a new method which has been deployed to work on these socio-economic models. So the levers are, firstly, thinking about the purpose and the modus operandi of the club. What do we want to do? With whom do we want to do it? In what area? So there's this notion of local connections, which is very important. And that brought us on to rethinking our relationship with alliances, cooperation, and of course, attempting to expand these. And then the third pillar of this approach is working on human resources, human wealth, whether these are volunteers or employees. Because in the amateur sports club sector, there are people who have an employment contract, but there are people who are working without any sort of real legal format, and these people, we want these people to continue. So there are major changes that have been underway for 30 years with different levers. By way of explanation, there's a project underway in a mining area in the Nord-Pas-de-Calais, so in the north of France. It's really a region that's heavily involved in mining. And so we thought about how, or the local authorities were thinking about how they could attract people to the region via sports tourism, based on the notion of the social and solidarity economy. And this experiment gave rise to explanations, to encouragements at the federal sporting level to bring about changes in the socio-economic model. And the results, I can give you these today, it's that it's not easy to change your socio-economic model when you're involved in a federal model that's already working fairly well, with the same practices being deployed year on year. And there's a lot of caution with regard to these changes. Firstly, because it involves taking risks, both financial and also in terms of human resources. And it means that you have to venture into new terrain, administrative, financial, etc., and that can be quite complicated. And there's also already too heavy a burden weighing on the administration, or rather too heavy an administrative burden weighing on the managers. There's also the costs, and this might encourage managers to expand the modus operandi of their club a little bit. But we aren't in a safe context. It's not a context which inspires a feeling of safety. After the COVID crisis, which really was it really shook the sporting sector. There were many, it affected the members, the clubs themselves. Even if things have picked up since, there's still quite a lot of trauma, and clubs have had trouble getting back on their feet again and maintaining their members. And so the reactions to these changes are fairly measured, fairly timid for the moment. in terms of changing the economic models. So to finish, in what we call federated clubs, 84%, and this is a figure from a survey that was carried out on resources. So this survey showed that 84% of income for clubs come from private sources, and the share of public funding by the local authorities in this case is only 16%. So we can see the model that we're dealing with here in this federal model. And we want to preserve that despite the difficulties we're facing currently, with some private partners that are starting to move away, and that has to do with the economic crisis that we're currently experiencing. Thank you very much, Guillaume. That ties into the first conclusions of the CEMASC project. So just stay with us for a minute, because we might ask you now about what the outlook is in terms of CEMASC's work. So what can the sports movement expect from the contributions to the research contributions made and projects such as CEMASC? So we've been working on the federal club model. We have some information. We carried out our own internal investigations. And when we were carrying out investigations into the resources of federations, we found that about 50 federations wanted to get involved and participate in questions and answers. But we don't have much information on the financial structure, so there are biases there. We need to have more information on what's going on with a more objective insight into these issues, and we need a sectoral perspective too. And also with the help of the Federation of Social Funds. We also need partners to objectively look at how things are with no complacency and tell us how they could change their models. And that's been done along with the CEMASC. Rather, what the CEMASC is doing is giving some very interesting, very insightful results. And at European level, it's even better, because we can compare the approaches that the approaches that are being taken by colleagues at European level, and particularly the fact of being able to see what's happening on an international level, and particularly in South America, is giving us a completely different view of things, which is very inspiring. So our models that have been working for 100 years, targeting fairly wide audiences, depending on the year, we can see that now we need to compare these with other ways of doing things, other methods, other perspectives to help us make some changes in the socio-economic models. So that would be my conclusion of these changes and the contribution made by CEMASC. It's all about opening minds, comparing different methods, and comparing different viewpoints of the development of the CSO and club sector, which are very inspiring. Thank you very much, Guillaume. Jan, talking about prospects, could you tell us what the next stage of the CEMASC project are? I think it's going to be finishing in 2026. So could we say that it might continue after that even? Thank you. Thank you very much to Guillaume for giving us his expert opinion and these historic facts about sports clubs and the socio-economic models. I'd perhaps like to add, before we talk about prospects, add that what is common to the study that we carried out between South America and European sports clubs, and what comes up very often in the narrative when we ask what the challenges are, it's being independent and the rise of independence. So rather, people saying, well, I'm practicing a certain sport myself, I'm not getting involved in any sort of club because the club requires that I respect rather that I turn up at a certain time, that I have a place to practice sport. There's also the digitalization of sport. People are practicing sport on their own. People have connected watches through which they can access training. And there's also competition, which is common to all sectors, with the development of private sports clubs and new practices which have emerged. And as Guillaume quite rightly said, there are clubs which currently, if they don't reinvent themselves in terms of the sports practices they propose, they are going to miss out on participation. If you look at tennis, for example, and if you look at paddle centres and how they've developed, or pickleball centres, we can see that it's a very volatile type of sport, and that new practices mean that clubs need to be able to quickly adapt, sometimes with limitations, such as the sporting facilities. You can't make a classic sports hall where you can just put a goal and you can put a goal net up with the lines on the floor into a paddle court, or another type of sport where the dimensions aren't the same. You can't do that. So there's that aspect which is common, which they have in common. And something that we find in terms of European clubs is this logic that has changed in terms of how subsidies are awarded. So perhaps generalizing, but when subsidies are awarded, if a club is known by the municipal council in a town, then you can be quite sure that the subsidies are going to come in. And so there's a logic which means that clubs are forced to respond to calls for projects. And so that means you need to have somebody in-house. You need to have human resources capable of responding to this new practice in terms of obtaining subsidies. So that was just what I wanted to say on challenges. And I agree with Guillaume in terms of value and what he said on that. Because if you're part of a club yourself, and I'm sure that among the participants today, many of you are part of a sports club or practice some kind of exercise anyway, some kind of physical activity. But if you're part of a club, not all clubs are able to show and display what the value is that they provide. What are the values behind the club? We looked into 4 clubs. So there was physical motivation, performance, contact with nature, health, and well-being. Those are the values that we found. And we can see that gradually we can make things more convivial, have more of a team spirit, and less of the competition performance aspect. There are clubs that specialise in that, but there are other clubs that specialise in more of a social aspect. We're seeing that more and more clubs are attracting members who are brought in by this narrative of we're a friendly club, this club will help you be in better health, will help your well-being. And we're seeing more and more people who aren't necessarily looking for sporting performance. So with regard to current prospects, and where we see this going. Well, we want to continue with a more and more representative sample. And we can see that there's an imbalance between Europe and Latin America currently. So we're encouraging our South American partners to continue collecting data. And what we need to bear in mind is that the number of sports clubs, amateur sports clubs, is lower in some countries, even though the population may be the same, than it is in France. That's the case of Argentina with 12,000 clubs. And in France, we have around 110,000 clubs or sporting associations. So there are quite significant imbalances, which means that there may be an imbalance in terms of the samples we take. So we need to continue collecting data. And at the same time, and that's the discussion that we had last week in Lisbon with our partners, it's all about developing a platform with educational tools. That's what we're currently involved in, and that will be made available to all clubs who have filled in their questionnaires. And they will be able to compare their socio-economic model with that of other clubs in the same area, in the same country, and in the same sports discipline. And once they've done that, they'll be able to access this teaching tools platform. We're not going to reinvent the wheel. Other people have done this very well. We're going to provide a link to this on the platform and develop more specific tools, perhaps, in different areas, which stem from what the results told us. Thank you very much, Jan. I have a question for Andre now. CEMASC is a project which generates very useful information in terms of strategies and the organization of clubs and federations for the public interest. So I have a question, because we're talking about participatory research here. So Andre, what has this project provided to the researchers? What has its benefit? What has been the benefit for these CEMASC researchers?
Okay, so let's go through a couple of points. I think that as researchers, it's really easy to fall into the habit of focusing mainly on theory, on abstract models, ideal frameworks. And don't get me wrong, that is also fundamental for research and for the advance of sports management. But sometimes we risk losing touch with practical realities that are faced by clubs that are on the ground. And as Jan said, in other words, reality is volatile and it's evolving. And it's evolving very fast. I believe that COVID, for instance, was a real sign of that. The impact that something can have from day to night on sports organizations. And so the challenges that amateur sports clubs face today are not the same that they were 5-10 years ago. And that's why it's so important for researchers to be closely connected to real world problems. And I think that projects like CEMASC really remind us of that. And so through this project, I think that we've been able to already capture a broad and a really good comparative picture of the national realities and between Europe and South America. And what emerges clearly to me is that amateur clubs are facing serious socioeconomic challenges. And many of them are simply not prepared to respond effectively today. We already knew the problems, we just confirmed them. There is a lack of strategic leadership. In many cases, clubs don't have the resources, the internal capacity or vision to take the next steps forward. And whether that's in their own specific governance, their financial planning, member engagement, whatever it is. Of course, every case will have its specific intricacies, but there are takeaways, general takeaways that we can gather from the general puzzle that we've drawn up here. And so I think that CEMASC gives us more than just data. It gives us real problems that research can follow, understand, and try to help solve, and also can create the capacity for these clubs or develop the capacity for these clubs that participated in the project to try and develop themselves and to try and get better through our research project and through our endeavors. So that's how I think that the SAMASC project really impacts research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andre. Thank you to all three of you. Now, let's move on to the question and answer session. Many of you have asked questions in the chat. The first set of questions that I'd like to ask Jan, and then the second set of questions I will ask Guillaume to respond to these. And then you'll each have 3 minutes each to sum up. So first question to Jan, is there a strong correlation between the size of the club, the budget, and whether there's the club is owned or not? For Jan, have you noticed disparities between the EU and South America? Have you drawn a correlation between efficiency indicators such as public policies, sporting results? Another question for Jan. There's more and more difficulties linked to economic criteria. What other sources of funding could there be for the clubs? And Guillaume can also chip in here. And I'll pick up on what Guillaume said, that 90% of network leadership structures want to expand what they're doing, so that ties into this question. So that's a first set of questions for you, Jan. And the next set of questions will be for Guillaume. Okay, so my first comment regarding the first question, the correlation between the size of the club, the budget, and the ownership. Well, with regard to the size of the club, what's for sure is that when you're part of a club with a greater number of members, there's a bigger budget. So there is a correlation between the size of the club and the budget. Being an owner, well, that is what makes a significant difference, as I see it, between the South American clubs and the European clubs. There are much more South American clubs which own their own sporting facilities, which is very rare in France. And when you go to a club, you can often see that it's the local authorities have provided the sporting facilities in France. So in South America, the budget for clubs has to be much higher because they have to look for these resources, not from the members. And I can tell you that with regard to the level of membership fees, it's much higher in South America than what we would accept to pay in France to go and be involved in a physical activity in a club. So that's the first thing. In South America, there are two main types of club. So if you've looked at the distribution of the number of members a little bit, in France, we have a huge number of members. There's a small proportion of clubs which do have more than 2,000 members, but the average is quite low. And in South America, the average number of members is 600. So that's fairly high. And then with regard to the second question, Florian, was it to do with, is there a significant difference between the EU and South American countries? Well, we're still collecting data, but to try and give a bit of an answer, we've compared South America and Europe, and the objective was to go into more depth so that we can compare significant differences between them and similarities too between South American countries and European countries. But we haven't gone into enough data really yet, but it is possible. The third question was on seeking sponsorship, which is becoming more and more difficult in the economic context and what are the other sources of funding for clubs in terms of what Guillaume said about 90% of clubs wanting to expand. So I'll tell you what I think. Sponsoring and corporate patronage outside certain clubs, of course, is not really very common for French clubs. These are more based on a model that dates back a fair few years, that's of having members and membership fees. So people pay their membership fees, and then there's a search for funding, subsidies too. And so looking for sponsorship and corporate patronage is really not very widespread in many clubs. As Guillaume quite rightly said, there are still a lot of clubs which have very few members and which are based on the membership fees. These clubs might look for subsidies because they want to show the local authorities that they're playing a role in education or at a social level. So there isn't too much sponsorship. And you can see that in South America, sponsoring and corporate sponsorship is not something that's very widespread either. So other resources are sought via social events, the kermesse, as it's called, having a drink stand, carrying out a club lottery, and that brings in income via the club's social events. And then other resources are sought too from actors by selling services. We can see European clubs which are proposing services. These are still a minority, but they're providing their services to companies or to certain structures, such as leisure centres where clubs go and provide certain services. So that's a change that's underway, where you go from your societal and social mission to actually proposing services and acting like a service provider in the private sector, as it were. Thank you very much. We'll take 2 more minutes now for our last round of questions, which are more for Guillaume. So the first is, does civic service play a new role in the organisation of clubs, because there are less limitations and more flexibility than an employee? Second, for subsidies, local authorities are more and more often asking clubs to provide certain services in the neighbourhood for people with disabilities, running leisure centres, etc. What do you think about this? So my question to you is, can you answer this? And there is this lever to diversify programmes which helps us to respond, to increase resources, to include elderly people too. And this structures our socio-economic revolution. But what I understand is that, and what we need to answer is, should we perhaps resist this a little bit, because it's asking too much of associations, of clubs, and it's changing the nature of what they do? And then another question, some clubs carry out external audits to improve their governance and their budget. What do you think of this? And so if you could please answer all of that in 3 minutes, because we then need to go to the next part. Okay, so let me sum up the challenge in 3 minutes. For civic service, that can play an important role in clubs, but we have to bear in mind that these are young people who need management. They need to be overseen. Their role needs to be well laid out, needs to be written out, and they need to have support from tutors or mentors or managers who oversee what they're doing every day, because otherwise very quickly they can get off track and people end up saying civic service doesn't work. And these people who have come to help, well, they don't get anything out of it either. So it's very important for them to be overseen. And that's quite a significant resource, for rather a significant cost to clubs. And so on the second question, the request from the local authorities, I'd like to bring it back to the principle of clubs. Clubs are a non-profit structure and they often have volunteers working with them to roll out these social projects. And what that means is that we've decided this on our own. And so at a certain point, our interests might converge with those of the local authorities. And in that case, it's interesting to explore this. But it doesn't mean that we absolutely have to do what the local authorities want us to do if it doesn't suit us, and if it would destabilise the purpose of the club. We can see these calls for projects, but nobody ever has to respond to a call for projects. And we can see that there's this trend in local authorities currently, which takes away from subsidies. And conversely, we could ask local authorities for a safe source, a secure source of subsidies, something more tangible to be able to develop something over the long term and make it last. So there's no obligation. And there is this principle attached to being a club. And then the third question on external audits, these structures do exist, and that enables companies to get involved. It's free for the clubs themselves who benefit from it. The principle is to help clubs ask questions about what they're doing and the way they're doing it. It's a good thing, I think, but subject to certain conditions. Firstly, the board needs to be fully in agreement on what the purpose of the club actually is, and they're able to write this down, and that it is actually already written down, so that they can then put it up for scrutiny by someone external. And then there needs to be a set of specifications determined which can be given to the consultant. And the issues need to be established so that light can be shed on these. And that requires upstream work by the board. It means that a board meeting needs to be held. There need to be the right skills involved. And thirdly, everyone must be willing to ask if they're really doing things the right way and to not hide anything. To ask questions of the financial aspect of the club, and also to really look into the management, whether it's a manager, an employee, whether it's volunteers, whether these people are qualified to be doing what they're doing, or whether we need to bring in new skills that aren't currently available. And this is a model that's quite complicated, because people really need to be willing to challenge themselves and have a real look at themselves, and to then set out some points that can be improved. And finally, once we have the feedback from the consultant, well, clubs don't just have to remain mute and just apply these points. There needs to be discussion by the board, discussion of whether it fits in with the purpose of the club, and what the conditions are, what the timescale is going to be, because you can't just do everything immediately. So these changes need to be planned over time to make it easier, because it's never easy. And also to help the members adapt to this. So those will be my recommendations. That was 2 minutes 30, I think. Thank you very much, Guillaume. Thank you, Andre. Thank you, Jan. Thanks to all of you for your questions and your answers. And now I will give the floor to Charles Benoit. Thank you very much, Florian. I'd like to go back to what Andre Calapes said, because I think he asked exactly the right question regarding the link between practitioners and researchers. The quicker the change is, the more practitioners and researchers need to share a common vision, which will be structural. But if there's one subject which we really need to ask this question of today in terms of changing practices, that's the issue of alliances at global level too. that's what the southern hemisphere asked of the northern hemisphere in 2015 in the light of the SDGs. We need to see what we can and can't do. And in France, this issue of alliances is not necessarily at the heart of our culture. And that is why the impact assessment, which was carried out between 2018 and 2022, in terms of the building societies, that enabled us to illustrate the ability to build alliances in terms of performance, etc. And the results that were published with this study with the Institute really helped us to see the details. So another slide, please. Since 2018, alongside this impact assessment, there has been a process with academic actors in order to work between practitioners and researchers on this approach. And since 2019, we have a bit of a systemic vision with regard running up to 2023, with shared responsibility between the local authorities, private and public organisations and people. And what is really important is that we listen to and learn from, collaborated with, and understood the value of this capacity to listen. This impact study generated statistics rather. There were 350 ecosystems that were studied, some at national level, some at local level. And this led us on to 2023 and 2024, when we wondered how we could link this approach involving all actors, all regions, to really ask the question of the connection between the local and international level, how it flows in both directions. And the CEMAS project really shows us an example of this, how things work in Europe and in South America, what is complementary, what is different, and what is similar. And that enables us to pinpoint where these differences or similarities are. And it's not necessarily where we think it's going to be. Last year, we reflected a lot with the researchers we're working with in terms of the partnerships with the Institute on the Building Societies project. And we thought about what the role of academic actors is in this transition that we're all going through. And once again, the question is, when we don't know what model we're working towards, how can we co-construct this between academic and actors and practitioners? Last year, we held a research seminar. That was the fourth one of its type in March last year. And in October last year, during a symposium at a university, the research was shared, rather the results of this study, that is the programme carried out between 2023 and 2024, on these local aspects, how small and middle-sized local areas can bring in the skills of the different actors, whether it's school establishments, companies, clubs, etc. That was work that was done last year, and it was published these were published the same day at the University of Socio-Economic, and during this symposium in Poitiers. And there was also a digital platform that was set up to make it more effective. And the question was, what local trajectories come into play on this issue, where the economic balance is a decisive factor and is determined by something that's not very often talked about, and that is the size issue. And what's interesting in this research, and I'd like to invite you to have a look at it, is that this size issue comes into play within organisations and within the regions. A small organisation in a large region, or the contrary, is very different. And there's the issue of this correlation between the size of the organisation and the size of the local area, and that is a decisive factor. Next slide, please. And then in 2025 rather, we went further into the role that research can play. The role of research was talked about in terms of disseminating empirical knowledge, and also to pinpoint complexity and to help students and teachers understand this capacity for learning by doing, that is to learn as knowledge is being generated. And then the third element, which was very interesting, was that we wanted to highlight the value of the social aspect of establishments, not just school establishments, but also higher education and research, because enabling students to experience this capacity to create links with their local area tied into the studies that were carried out in 2023 among young people. And this really called for the creation of very specific responses linked in with the local areas in the face of the current challenges. And what was very present in the academic area was this transformation of social responsibility in terms of the main role, which is to teach, and also to build knowledge, which is more and more being co-created with practitioners. To illustrate this, next slide, please. We highlighted a number of practices in co-creation. There were 3 levels of construction, what we call engaged approaches, built-in approaches, and bridging approaches. So for engaged approaches, it has to do with how practitioners, how actors are involved in the work carried out, whether it's research, teaching, or social responsibility of establishments. And then built-in approaches is a bit the opposite. That's how practitioners take it on board in order to create this in their practices and in the research aspect as well. And then the bridging approach, well, the inspiring example that we saw was by the French Institute for Civil Society Organizations, and it really shows how there can be a bridge between these 2 realities that are being built at the same time. That's very interesting. So if we look at the Zoom that has been carried out, we can see that the question is, well, in 2018, this vision was co-created. And in terms of the public interest, how can we put together a shared vision highlighting the role at the time and currently, of course, because we're not very far away from the 2030 agenda. How can we have this structural and democratic role and a common framework for all areas, for all actors in the light of the 2030 agenda, bringing in the responsibility of local ecosystems, the public, private actors, etc. How can all of these actors work together? And within all of this, how can we come up with solutions? How can we build these? So this year in 2025, what's very interesting is this notion of localized projects where public policy and committed people work together, men and women, clubs, associations, academic, economic actors, all of this diversity. How can this convergence take place in the local areas? And this year there's a question of what are the prospects for companies in 2050 rather. So the question is, how are the local areas experiencing this reality? How are these transitions being undertaken? 80 local areas were observed. And then the question is, how can we capitalize on this? How can we normalize the subject? Because in 2021, a draft law was submitted on an alliance of public interest organizations. And so is this law going to go through Parliament? So very specifically, the first step is to carry out an overview of the contributions of empirical research on the issues involved, to create this shared vision, to have a sort of compass in terms of performance, innovation and trust. And how can we feed into this via means of action and feedback from practices on the ground? How can we provide these elements to help people do what they do on a daily basis. And I'd like to come back to this shared vision. Obviously, it's very important to build this narrative with the institutions and those involved, along with the organisations. And that's public and private organisations, which are pioneers. And also bringing in academic actors. The 5th research seminar, which will be organised on the 25th of September, will touch on this. And this approach, feeding into this vision, the capacity for action, providing a compass, providing something clear-cut in order to share practices, this has been tried and tested. And our recommendation, when we're talking about empirical research, is that we need a minimum of 7 years of practice in the area, because otherwise we're just blowing hot air. And so we need to have a real solid practice, because otherwise the risk is a bit like with well, it's a bit like with drug trials. You can't prescribe a drug before it's been through 10 years of clinical trials. And so we can't go into researching on this without having a solid practical basis. Next slide, please. The main question is to work on how we can do this quickly, but do this quickly with values, prioritizing a sustainable impact and trajectory, and doing this inclusively. How can we do it together? After all of this work, in terms of qualification, this emergence of this co-construction dynamic, which emerged in 2023 after 14 years of empirical research. Well, the current question is, how can we speed this up, linking the different phases, that is considering current fragilities and also thinking about tomorrow's world? And how can we do this via economic actors? 4 types of economic actors, because there are 4 types of ecosystem that have been particularly studied this year. Public actors, balanced actors, we were talking about social centres earlier. These play a very important role. And these are financed by the CNAF, which is a parity-based organisation. For 70 years, there's been work on this parity in management. And there's the question of how we can meet these sectoral challenges, bringing this economic dynamic close to the local authorities. So that's the eco actors. And then there's the IG actors. And these are general interest actors, so it should be GI actually in English translation. And so these are 4 projects that we were involved in this year that we wanted to share with you. Next slide, please. So what we're going to do next, well, continue the assessment of practices in terms of partnerships, capitalising on knowledge. And this year, after in 2023, having listened to young people, having asked young people to talk, because we don't want to put ourselves in the place of young people, we want to allow them to talk. So last year we were talking to local authorities, MPs, or rather locally elected representatives. And this year we have a pilot study on trends and economic fragility. And we are asking everyone to respond, whether they're no matter what type of economic actor they are, no matter what status they have, whether it's a classic status or not. Everyone is invited to respond, because it's a matter of economy. It's a matter that directly affects them. So we want to know, what are the trends in terms of economic fragility? And what's interesting about this study is that we used the same questionnaire as in 2020. That was because it enabled us to observe, with regard to what we were doing in 2020, we did it in June 2020, so it was just after the COVID crisis. So we want to compare what the fragilities observed are, and then come up with solutions. And the second important element this year, next slide, please. Next slide, please. It's the issue of finalising the knowledge model, finalising knowledge modelling rather, via these 7 types of expertise which were capitalised upon over the past 20 years and have now been finalised. Tomorrow with the INIAC, we have a lesson on the European programme, the Social Impact Manager, a lesson at the Sorbonne University in France in partnership with these actors on how we can recognize and use emerging practices in terms of these new forms of managing the public interest, managing innovation, which concern all of us. And of course, this approach is at the heart of the subject. On these subjects, you see that there are 7 skills that are necessary, and those in the middle, the one in the middle rather, is to transform the socio-economic model, and that's been underway since 2020. There's a monthly webinar. This is really at the heart of the subject. There can be no development of new models without a real economy that is balancing your books, and that means having your house in order. It's not about marginalization, it's about balancing what you're doing, whether it's about companies, whether it's about families. Everybody needs to understand the diversity involved in these economic models. So before we go on to this month's news, let's just have the next slide, please. The essential point is how we can demonstrate the value of this emerging knowledge. Discovering a subject is easy in pedagogical terms. We can also provide training from initial training until university level. We can do that. But how can we highlight emerging expertise when knowledge has not yet been shaped and modeled for this? How can we build this incredibly innovative educational approach on the local approach, the hybridization of economic models, cooperation, etc., based on our own experience, and highlight this? That's something which is decisive. We need to get to grips with emerging expertise and see which are the models that are best adapted to the realities we're living through. And although we can't model tomorrow's results, we need to continue this approach to highlight practices. And I'd like to invite you to read Cécile Cotte and Laurent Lilly's memo on local projects and the emergence of new practices. It's absolutely fascinating, and it explains a lot. And it explains that in 2021, when we submitted the draft law on the right to alliances on the public interest, when we were engaged in this experiment, we didn't know what a public interest right was. We needed to experience it first on a wide scale in many practices before we knew this. So these are skills that tie into law, and I would like to invite you to take the same approach as when developing a new drug. That is, you need to approve each stage of the process before going on to the next one. And so moving on to the last part of the presentation, we need to accelerate territorial transitions, and I'd invite you to look at the results of what the 80 different local areas said. And I won't unveil what I'm going to present in an upcoming session right now, but what we can see is that when we listen to the actors and when we really go from the grassroots and see what the resources are, how people want to be committed, then we can come up with the right solutions and leave behind this approach of just trying to push people along, trying to push solutions along and force them on people. We need to go back to the grassroots, and that's the capacity of the practitioners in the field, in the local areas, to come up with solutions. Because you can't just impose solutions. You need to go from the bottom up of the project. That's what's essential. And the last point, and then I'll stop and give the floor to Jan. So last slide, please. I would like to cordially invite all of you on the 25th of September to celebrate 10 years since the signature of the 2030 agenda on the SDGs, and also to share in the results of the research seminar on building the common good, which will be followed that evening by a conference evening on what the role of academic actors is to create the common good, bearing in mind that we will have had the results of the study in the meantime on partnership, etc. So I would really like to ask you to respond to this study, to this survey, because the greater the diversity of the actors that respond is, the better. And we're not talking about just one actor, we're talking about a set of ecosystems. And when that's the case, it's a completely different thing. There will be a remarkable presentation of tomorrow's businesses with regard to the inter-regional approach 2025. So I would like to invite you to listen to this. And there will be a presentation of the prospects for tomorrow's companies. It will be fascinating. And to introduce these three sessions, the Minister will be present to remind us that we must not do things for young people, we must do things with young people. So the research seminar will be introduced directly from Chartres by young people who are involved in a research master's at Angers University, who will come and tell us, after having listened for a week and explored this capacity to co-create in Chartres, they will come and tell us what people actually think of it. Because the most important thing in all of this is that they are present here with us, doing all of this alongside us, so that we can set up these regional, local projects that involve all of us. Thank you very much, Charles Benoit. Can we go on to the next slide, please? The next one after. So I am delighted now to present this month's news. So going from, or rather it's the Thursdays on, the SDG Thursdays, that's what we call them. And this is for July. In June, by way of introduction, the news was all about the ecological transition, with a very specific aspect, that is the sheet that gives you a 360-degree view of this area, led by a partnership which sheds light on the SDGs and which shows the steering that is in place at the regional level, and then feedback showing the set of solutions that exist at regional level, at local level, which is part of the series of webinars that we're running and podcasts as well, with the journalist Patrick Lonchot, and then data and resources in order to have a bird's eye view of all of this. It comes from studies and data from important actors, and it comes from civil society, of course. Next slide, please. In June, there are 3 stages. There were 3 stages. Yesterday, we had an interview with Raphael Gasque, who is network leader of the National Network for Educational Organizations. This afternoon, in a few hours, there will be a new monography from the ADASI. They've published a guide with examples on socio-economic models for the public interest. And then in a few days' time, on the 26th of June, in the morning with Paul Maitre, you will be able to discover e-health. And this has to do with partnerships too. And Paul Maitre is an expert in e-health. Next slide, please. The tool of the month. We talked about this last week on the 12th of June, within the framework of the meeting of the local representatives meeting. This is a compass that has to do with the local level and helps us understand how we can use the diversity of dynamics and the different networks of actors where we live in order to steer and manage the collective dynamic and what the profiles of these actors are. This compass was developed for the Grand Est region of France. Next slide, please. So just the final word, something to put down in your diaries. Please reserve the It's Thursday, 18th of September, because it will be the 50th webinar of the Socio-Economic platform, and the focus will be on local ecosystems and how the local level links in with national and international levels. And this follows on from the very exciting study run by SEMASC, which we will be discovering later on. So those are the things I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much to you for listening. And I'm delighted with that all our speakers were here today with us to share what you had to say. It was very interesting to hear about the diverse models that we have locally in France, in Europe, in Latin America, where we know that the situation is not exactly the same. Thank you to everybody. Have a nice day. See you very soon.